So my name is Elena Wyth. I am from the Kingdom of Ansteorra, and today, or this evening for me, we will be talking about the Middle Eastern pigment palette. So a little bit about me. I'm actually, like I mentioned, I'm from the Kingdom of Ansteorra in the barony of Loch Solier. And Loch Solier is mundanely south of Houston, Texas. So I'm on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. On this slide is a picture of some of the pigments I've collected for this class. I was elevated to the, or I was invited to join the Order of the Laurel and did so May 2nd of this year. And my primary focuses are parchmenting, Middle Eastern pigments, and illumination. I also do a fair amount of heraldry on the side, and I was actually just formally announced as the principal herald for our kingdom a couple of hours ago. Thank you. So I'm now formally Star Principal Herald. Okay. All right. So the data set. What this class is it's a brief survey of the available literature in English regarding raman spectroscopy analysis of manuscripts that are generally found in a very generous, defined Middle East. Essentially, anywhere the Islamic Empire was, plus or minus a couple of countries that I thought were interesting. I will make the PowerPoint available for this class afterwards, and the information is also available on my website, which I should have mentioned, and I'll make sure to grab the link for. Specifically, the countries covered in this class are Afghanistan, Byzantium, India, Iran, Iraq, Persia, Tibet, Turkey, and Uzbekistan. And largely, I'm just pulling through anything I can find that has raman spectroscopy studies. And I do have a list and link to every study that I've been able to pull together. I do also include two painting manuals, the only two that I know of that have been translated from Persian to English. It's Qadi Ahmad's Calligraphers and Painters, which was written somewhere between 1576 and 1602, and Sadiqi Bek's The Canon of Painting, which is written in 1608. Qadi Ahmad's Calligraphers and Painters is actually available for free from the Freer Gallery. The other is something that was, both of these are actually indexes to larger works, but Sadiqi Bek's Canons of Painting is actually one of those things that's only been printed in the Houghton Chamonix, and it's very difficult to find copies of that book. I was lucky that there are two in Houston and was able to get copies of that. So if anybody's interested in those painting manuals, please make sure to message me, and I will send that information over to you. One thing I do want to kind of cover before getting much further, for those who are familiar with Persia and Iran, they are largely, the same area. I use the country of origin based on what the study said. So while the Persian manuscript may have originated in what is Iran now, if the study says Persia, I list it as Persia. If the study says Iran, I list it as Iran. So what's the big deal? What is raman spectroscopy? It is shooting it with laser beams. You pew, pew, pew. It is a monochromatic laser beam that is shot at the manuscript, and you measure how the light bounces. So raman spectroscopy readings have been around, so the machine has been around since 1928. The problem with that machine was that it was as big as a room, if not several rooms. And so when scientists were like, hey, bring your books over and we want to shoot laser beams at them, librarians and curators were rightfully hesitant, to say the least. It wasn't until the 90s that the machine was actually portable enough that it could be taken to the books. And that's why you're starting to see spectroscopy readings and studies. Like they're really starting to gain momentum, and it's really awesome. However, the manuscripts that are getting read are the ones that people are getting grants for, and largely you're finding that there's a ton of European manuscripts that are being studied, and not so much with non-European manuscripts. So it is, I have found at least, that it is much harder to find non-European manuscripts. And that was part of what pulled this together. I wanted to know what paints were actually, what were they actually using? What pigments were actually being used? So that's what I tried to pull together here was the, this is what they were using. And then the painting manuals are, this is what they said they were using. Anything that I've listed here isn't proving a negative. Just because they haven't found it doesn't mean it wasn't used. It just means they haven't found it yet. So I don't want to give off any definitive vibes here. This is purely a collection of my research that I want to share as far and wide as possible, and would love for you to help me build it if you are so interested. So the one thing with Raman spectroscopy is that you measure the photons and they scatter in a specific way. The problem is when shooting organic material, it doesn't read as well. So Raman spectroscopy is fairly specific to inorganic materials, so minerals from the earth versus matter from a plant. It can still read those, but it's not as accurate. So predominantly my findings are mineral-based. So organic versus inorganic. That's really, when you're looking at pigments, they break into those two categories. So organics are your insects and your plants. Inorganics are going to be your rocks or other minerals like white lead or verdigris. The biggest finding that I can say, the overarching discovery, was that Middle Eastern Middle Eastern manuscripts, they all mixed like Bob Ross. When I first got in the SAA and when I first started learning painting, it was very much all of your colors are pure and you don't really mix except for Virgo. You just don't mix. Whereas what we found with these Middle Eastern manuscripts is they were mixing anything and everything with wild abandon. So in my study, I try to show all of those breakdowns that they have parsed. So how do you read this thing? And now I'm going to post in the chat box a direct link to my Google Doc that is this big old spreadsheet. This spreadsheet is also on my WordPress site. It's elenawyth.wordpress.com. And it breaks out both narrative and the good stuff. But I feel that it's not as easy to use in the little window of WordPress, so I wanted to give you guys the direct link to that Google document. And the way I have the Google document is the first tab, that first worksheet, is the sources. And then all the other tabs are broken down by color. So the red tab will be all of your reds. The first column is location, where the manuscript is from. Second is the source. That's, when I say source, I mean the study source. And these numbers correspond with that first tab. So number 9, go to number 9 in my resources, that's the study it's from. The general century, the exact date if we have it, and then the minerals are listed out and there's an X if it was found. And you'll see, like with this in Afghanistan, the 16th century manuscript had cinnabar, and I have ink written. Well, they found a cinnabar they found cinnabar in the ink. So if there are small things like that, I haven't broken out ink yet, it's in my to-do list. So hopefully that makes this more understandable for you, because the whole point is for everybody to be able to understand. I didn't actually talk about how to ask questions. If you have them, I encourage them. Please interrupt me, stop me, send up a flare, or type in the chat, since I can't see the chat. I'm super excited about that. So, gonna get into the nitty-gritty. White and black. So first, white. Universally, lead white was your white pigment. If you see white, you see lead white. There was, in Kadi Ahmed's book, he talks about using antimony. but it hasn't been found yet. So I'm not sure if it was something that was actually used or if he just threw that in there for grins. Calcite has also been found, and chalk has been found. The chalk is also a size, so some of the studies, they weren't sure if that was there as pigment or there as part of the size on the paper. For black, carbon-based black was by far the most prominent pigment. But you also find gouache. So gouache is cool. It's like a MacGyver mineral because it comes in many different colors. So you're going to see it in many different category of color. In 11th century Persian work, we found that it was used in a black, but it's also brown and yellow and can come in orange as well. There was a cool thing in a Tibetan work that found carbon black that was enriched with copper, or the copper compound. And what that copper compound happened to be was human blood. And they know it was human blood because of the way the photons moved. They tested it against other blood, and they then had a lab assistant who donated for the cause and found that it was a match. So it was Tibetan writing in a carbon black that also had human blood involved. And that, I am unashamed to say, is the reason why Tibet features in this, because I've only found one study so far, but that was just too cool to pass up. So if you want to write in blood, you now have some docs for that. So I made very quick and dirty tables for those who can't do multi-screen or want to look at the link later. So this is what I was talking about, where almost everybody was using lead white and almost everybody was using a carbon-based black. There should be a line there, and I apologize that it did not transfer over. But the idea is that if you're doing an Iranian piece that's 13th century, you can go to Iran, 13th century, and look at what pigments they were using, and then you've got that kind of basic breakdown. And then here's the other half of that. This is much easier to see in the singular spreadsheet as opposed to broken up. And here's my ink with copper for Tibet. Reds. Reds are the most studied color in all of the studies. Like, there's a ton of them, so much so that I actually broke out the table for pure reds and then red mixes. I ended up doing the same thing for green. Red, however, was almost always vermilion, and or cinnabar. So the thing with vermilion is that it is cinnabar, but it is synthetic. And it's synthetic because cinnabar is a crystalline structure that grows. It is a mineral that you can pick up and use. Vermilion is where you take mercury, sulfur, seal it in a vessel, superheat it, and it creates this black substance that as you grind, you get vermilion, and as you grind it, it gets redder and redder. So it created a wide variety of hues, and it was a very deep, rich red. They were also using a lot of red lead, minium, which is used from heating lead. You roast it until it turns from yellow to it's a more orangey red. There are many studies that were able to pick out alizarin madder or cochineal, which is actually carmine. And the cool thing about carmine is that the carmine insects come from the Kermes oak in the Mediterranean. They're actually 1/10 the coloring power of the cochineal that we get stateside. So I found that to be really interesting, because if I've collected cochineal because I live in Texas, and they're tiny little bugs, and the idea that I would need like 10 times as much to create the pigment, it just blows my mind. And so it's the Kermes carmine is a cousin to the cochineal that is
Elena,
often used. Yes.
it's a dumb question from me.
Sure.
So when I hear you talking about this, you say lead, you say copper, and somehow sounds very toxic.
Yes.
Can you say something about the toxicity working with it? But then also, I wonder if it's toxic to us, must be toxic to the paper might be reactive, might not be stable, but it must be stable because we have like, it stayed there for 800 years. Can you say something about that, about the reactivity?
Yes, so almost all of this stuff is poison. The rocks that I showed in the very beginning, I have sitting next to me, I have a very, like, do not lick the rocks, do not lick the manuscript. All of these are poisonous, almost all of these are poisonous on some level. I mean, vermilion is mercury and sulfur. There's some copper in our blood, but too much copper is not good for us. So you don't want to go inhaling copper-based greens. Copper usually gives us green colors, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And there was a period solution for dealing with the eating away of the substrate, and I don't want to spoil it yet, even though I really want to. But I will get to that. Mostly these were stable enough as far as like acidity, like eating at the paper. Now I will say that when in the Middle East, when they transferred from parchment to paper, they had to change up their inks from oak gall to carbon-based, in part because the acidity of the iron gall was so high that it was eating through paper. I assume that they found some balance because they were still using iron gall ink for browns, spoiler, but they were using for inks, they were using much more carbon black and lamp black for inks instead. I'm sorry, I keep trying to click my, trying to click and highlight my presentation.
After the second paragraph you were just at the end of the red.
So yeah, so we have carmine, we have vermilion or cinnabar, we have red lead. So your dark red, your deep reds, your orange reds. Carmine is another deep red, but it can go towards pinks as well. And then we have realgar. So realgar is very similar to orpiment, if you're familiar with orpiment, in that it's an arsenic sulfide and it's found in similar conditions. The main difference between realgar and orpiment is the color. And I don't know if you guys can actually see me. I don't know if I can make this focus there. So this is actually both. Here we go. The realgar, realgar is reddish to orange, depending on how much light it's seen. The more UV light it's seen, the more yellow it becomes. Oh, I see Lady Eleanor lost audio. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, that's all good.
So? Okay, sorry. I know that there was concern about audio. So the thing with realgar is that it's reddish, and as it sits out in the light, it goes to yellow. But it is an arsenic sulfide, so it is a poison. So don't lick it. And then finally, we have iron oxide, which could be created from goethite or hematite. And those are going to be their deep, earthy brown reds. Tibet also had a rose color that was found with a mixture of red lead and orpiment and cinnabar, and then darker reds were red lead and iron oxide. But let me get to all the mixes, because there's a ton of mixes. I had so much in this paragraph. I was like, I'll let the data speak for itself. So with red, so you can see vermilion and red lead almost exclusively. You are safe if you have those things and you're looking to recreate a thing. But I do have some madder, some red earth. Iran had the carmine. There was, because I mentioned the organics, organic red is likely madder, but if the study didn't tell me what they thought it was, if the study just said organic red, then that's how it's listed here. I had one study that listed insect dye, and I just went ahead and threw that in carmine because I knew what that was. I made the assumption for them. So with the mixes, and I kind of went crazy with having to list things, like getting all the words in. So they were mixing everything: vermilion and red light, vermilion and cinnabar, vermilion and orpiment, vermilion and madder. organic red plus lead white. They were doing tons of different mixes to get different hues of red. And so I will say that not every study has shown mixes. So you'll notice that, like, let me scroll back. I realize it can be difficult, but you see there's like 2 pages of studies here, and then my mixes is just 1, and that's because I'm only listing the ones that actually have those mixes listed out in the study. Doesn't mean they weren't, it just means they weren't found and reported. So yellows. Orpiment. Orpiment is your yellow. Orpiment is your go-to unless you're doing India, and then India was using India yellow, which is no longer in production because India yellow is made from feeding cows exclusively mango leaves, which have no nutritional value, and it is used from processing their urine. So India yellow is no longer allowed to be produced because it is cruel, but there are many synthetic India yellows that are gorgeous. And you can kind of see here, to me it's a very Ansteorra yellow, so, you know, close to my heart. But orpiment is your go-to. There were also studies with para-realgar, and I mentioned it briefly, that if you take realgar and it sits in the sun long enough, it color shifts to yellow. Another thing was massicot and litharge. The thing with lead is as you heat it, it goes from white to yellow to red. So if you stop it or heat it in specific ways, you get different colors. So if you roast white lead, you get massicot. If you let the lead oxidize, if you oxidize molten metallic lead, you get litharge. And I've got those in the bottom right corner. You can see the crazy difference in those 2 colors. And then gurutite, like I said, the MacGyver of minerals, because it does come in yellow. Essentially, I feel that if they found a mineral in the color they needed, they would use it. One cool organic yellow that was mentioned in one study was the root of, or is rhubarb, which is lightly the root of rhubarb. And it was in Iranian examples in the 16th and 17th century. Now, I did, you know, the Google searching and found that rhubarb root is a medicinal material in Eastern medicine, and it is a very distinct yellow color. So I have a feeling that that's what they were using. I haven't experimented yet because you can only get rhubarb root in ginormous quantities, but it's something that I hope to experiment with. So again, orpiment, shoo, all the orpiments. And then India yellow was fairly stuck in just India, but it was found in an Iranian example. And then you have some mixes. India was also the ones primarily using the massicot and litharge. But you have lightning orpiment with lead white. You have making it more orange with vermilion. So it's kind of standard orpiment. You're doing pretty good for that if you're looking for yellows. Blues. Blues are my favorites. My heraldry is blue and white for a reason. And blue, you're looking at lazurite. And this is the tiniest soapbox that I stand on for this presentation. And that's ultramarine is made from lazurite. Lazurite is the mineral. When it is polished and, you know, essentially gemstone form, it is lapis lazuli. So, or most folks know of the mineral as lapis lazuli. But the pigment is lazurite, or the mineral is lazurite, the pigment becomes ultramarine. Afghanistan is the premier source for that. So, like, these guys are going to have an easier time to get it than the rest of the world, but it was still precious, which is why most folks were also using lazurite's country cousin, azurite, which is a copper-based mineral. Another organic material that we know that folks were using was indigo. Indigo, if they weren't using, like they were using indigo and they using lazurite, those two blues are your go-to blues. Indigo is made from the indigofera plant. I was lucky in that some dyers at Gulf War gave me a small satchel of it, which I covet and I need to get more of. But there were, again, tons of mixing. Just go to the data. Lazurite. So this Iranian azurite with inclusions. The thing with azurite is that it is very difficult to find it without its twin malachite, which is a green. They grow together a lot. So this azurite with inclusions was actually a malachite inclusion. So it would have created a somewhat teal color as a result. And the only reason I should have said this in the very beginning, the reason I did not include images of where they shot, like from the manuscripts, is often they didn't include them, or because these manuscripts, or because all of this is behind a paywall, I didn't give myself enough time to find out if it would be okay to show that information. But like I said, I'm willing to share with you offline. Lazurite and lead white. So if you want a light blue, that's your plan. Get your ultramarine, mix in some lead white, you're good to go. But as you can see, everybody was using lazurite, almost nothing else. There was a bit of mixing, but yeah, lazurite's your blue. For greens, so verdigris and malachite, those are going to be, see. Suneva says, can you tell us what basis the manuscripts use for determining which yellows were Indian yellow? There are so many plant-based yellows, how could they tell? I cannot. I took their word for it as scientists, and I'm happy to share with you the manuscripts that I pulled the information from. I know that they used XRF and raman spectroscopy in almost all the studies, because they were pulling for organics in some places as well. But yeah, shoot me a message and I will send you that to see if they say a little more about it. So green, verdigris and malachite. Those are your strong contenders for your greens. Now verdigris is made, it's a precipitate on copper. You suspend copper in a sealed container with some vinegar. It doesn't rust at verdigris, and you scrape that off wearing protection, because this stuff, as mentioned, this stuff is not good for you to inhale. So with all of these things, if you plan on using them, use proper protection. But that, or the malachite, which is copper-based. And here's the big reveal. Anybody who's studied insular manuscripts know, especially early on, we know where green was, we know where verdigris was, because there's a giant hole where the verdigris was. The Persians knew about this, and they mixed a little bit of saffron. And that saffron created this like chemical condom that, like, it ends up raising the pH, I believe. It creates a buffer, and it prevents the corrosion from occurring on the page. So there is a study, and I've got the study, that tested how much saffron is needed, because saffron is very dear. It's expensive. It's when you harvest it, you get 4 little bits per flower. You don't need a whole lot. It raises the pH just enough that it creates a buffer between that and what would affect the pH that makes the page eat away, which is why we have intact verdigris pieces from the Middle East. So adding a little bit of saffron does not change the color, but does protect the page. And I thought that was amazingly cool. And they knew that this is what was necessary to protect that page from the effects of verdigris on paper. Another green was vergote, and it's the mixture of indigo and orpiment, so your arsenic base. And let's see, we also had some atazamites, broconite, langite. If there is, and those are all copper-based minerals. So if you're seeing a copper-based mineral out in the wild, it was probably used for green somewhere. But those were not found in nearly as many sources as your verdigris and your malachite. There was several studies that were just like, it's copper green. And I don't know why they didn't dig deeper into copper green, but that's why I have listed just copper green. And then this Persian, it was a compilation of several studies from the 14th to the 17th century, and that's the Persian. So number 4, study number 4, is the one that talks about adding the saffron. And then indigo and orpiment, so your Virgo, huge for green. Oh yeah, sorry, that's right. So green, oh, sorry, dizzying. So green, your solid greens, and then all your green mixes. So if you're mixing for a green, you're mixing indigo and orpiment, almost to the exclusion of everything else, but we had to let everybody else play along. And that's the last of the green mixes. I'm on time. Okay, so browns. Iron gall ink is a pretty predominant brown. You take the galls of, you take oat galls, you crush them up, you add tannic acid, or you extract the tannic acids, and you get an iron sulfite. Mix all that in, add some gum, you've got an ink, you've got a paint. You get oat galls from wasps, and from what I understand, oat galls from Aleppo are far higher in tannic acid than in other places, which is why it takes more, at least stateside, it takes far more iron gall, or it takes far more oat galls to make ink than it does Aleppo galls. It's kind of interesting trivia. I haven't done a one-to-one comparison myself, but I trust those who have. If they weren't using iron gall, like ochres, essentially your dirts were pretty common. Gurtite, again, hematite, which I said is a brownish red. And then there's a ton of mixes for browns. So browns are kind of all over the place. A lot of hematite and vermilion, interestingly enough. But browns they do kind of run the gamut. And you can see my pures are like 3 or 4. My mixes are legion when it comes to brown. And then oranges. Oranges are kind of the same way. There weren't as many studies, brown and orange, both of these, there were not as many studies that even tested them. So I have a much smaller sample size. But oranges were usually minium or realgar. So, you know, you've got your red lead that is not quite full on orange or full on red. Was pretty high standard for your oranges. They would also tone it down a little bit. Red lead and orpiment. You've also got vermilion, so red and orpiment, yellow to get an orange color. Like I said, not as many studies on orange. So for metallics, there were a few studies that actually looked at the metallics, and a few of those had both silver and gold to test. And it was cool because when looking at the studies, or when looking at what they studied, they never found mosaic gold. They always found pure gold, except in one case where they studied the binding of a book, and it was real gold plus mica plus orpiment. And I think that it was just used to to stretch and make sparklier the gold that was on the cover of this book binding. There's also some pieces in Iran and Uzbekistan that were silver-rich gold. It's believed that they were actually mixing silvers and golds to get your kind of multi-tonal silvers and gold. So you had a lighter gold or a more goldish yellow. I know that a lot of folks have seen those fine tech palettes of beautifulness and the different degrees of gold, and this is an excuse to use all of those degrees because they were doing that sort of thing in period, and they were just doing it with actual gold and silver. All of the gold and silver studied was shell gold, and let's see, boop, go to that. Not every study had silver included, so where it is gray, that is where silver was not talked about. And the bits were gold or silver. They weren't a third, like, tin based. Here's that Afghani, it was an Afghani book. It was lead, white, orpiment, gold, and mica. Where it says silver rich gold, that's where they were mixing golds. So you had a gold and a light gold. And then where it says gold in parentheses with silver, that's where there is trace amounts of gold or silver, and it's believed that they essentially they use the same paintbrush for both. And if you've worked with shell gold or silver before, you know that those particles live there forever now. And so believe that that's part of the trace that went into those different areas of measurement. So I wanted to make sure that the silver-rich gold was understood as on purpose, and the parentheses was likely accidental or in trace amounts. My last bit is inks. Like I said, I have not broken out inks yet. Inks were, iron gall was popular. There's actually a gurutite ink-based ink in Persia. And then the Tibetan ones I'd mentioned about that had the blood involved. For red inks, there's the cinnabar. It was in Afghanistan and Tibet. Vermilion was used frequently. There's a reddish purple ink that was vermilion with madder. And there's also gold ink that was often used with shell gold. Sorry about that. And then, like I'd mentioned, carbon-based black was predominantly used. So what's interesting is that in one of the two painting manuals, there was actually a recipe for whiteout. And it was Qadi Ahmad, he and his painters and calligraphers, or calligraphers and painters rather, he essentially talks about, in removing text, he's like, mix some lead white with some gum arabic, apply it over the text, let it dry, burnish it, and write over it. So as a scribe who doesn't like scraping on paper because paper is so fine, it amused me greatly that that we can now use whiteout for realsies because it is totally a period technique. Here are a few suggestions for gouache substitutes. These are specifically Winsor Newton, and as of 6 months ago, these were all still inks, or still gouache that you could purchase from them. I know that there are many different gouache brands. Winsor Newton is just the one that I'm most familiar with. But your vermilion, you can get it from Alizarin Crimson or Spectrum Red. Red lead can be cadmium scarlet or cadmium red. They have an ultramarine, so you're good on that. Their cobalt blue is good for azurite. For verdigris, you can use cypress green or permanent green deep. The thing with verdigris is that it swings wildly from this violently 80s bright greenish bluish teal to a more subdued green. And I have a piece, my first A&S piece, I did a verdigris bit, and it was like garish 80s color, and 2 years later it's like mellowed out into a more normal green, like what you see in the manuscript. And I was like, that is really cool, but also it's fugitive a little bit. So weird. So depending on what color of verdigris you're looking for, cypress green or permanent green deep. Malachite, I would go for brilliant green. Vergote is an olive green. Orpiment, their lemon yellow is a really good color. India yellow, cadmium yellow, or permanent yellow deep. White, go for the permanent white. The difference with permanent white and titanium white, I think is their other one, is that permanent white is meant to be the white color. Titanium white is for mixing. Black, at least that's what I was told. That is how I grew up. Black, you can use lamp black or ivory black. Orange would be the cadmium orange. Iron gall would be your burnt umber. And then earth browns would be raw umber or burnt sienna. So as I mentioned, this is far too tiny for you to read, I'm sure, but these are the 14 studies plus the 2 rating manuals that mentioned. I don't actually talk about purple. I have it mixed in with red, and I meant to mention it, and I totally failed. So I will scroll back to reds because I didn't break it out on its own, and I probably ought to, but since they don't identify it as purple always, I just left it in with reds. So the red mixes, they were doing, so I've got some in with reds and I've got some in with blues. Essentially, they were using, maybe I've got it in with the blues more than the reds. They were mixing indigo and vermilion. Yeah, let me go check the blues now. Indigo and vermilion, lazurite and insect dye. That's that insect dye that I was talking about. So these are your purples. Lazurite and indigo and vermilion would be your purples largely there. I seem to remember that there was another, but I don't want to keep scrolling back and forth on you guys. Unless we want to go digging for info, which I'm also down for. You heard that in the 14th century they still called lavender brown. Possible. It's I'm not super familiar with it, but I'm still kind of new into my deep dive of. But I did have a vermilion and indigo hit on it being called brown in the study, so it is possible. There's also a vermilion and unknown, vermilion and orpiment. So these are colors and browns that I could easily see leaning into the purple realm. Like parareal gar, vermilion. So parareal gar is probably a yellowish vermilion, which is your red, and then azurite is your blue. So I can see those leaning into the purple as well. It's something I will definitely dig into more because it's not something I have checked. So that is actually my presentation. We definitely have more, definitely want to try to answer more questions. Like I said, I don't know everything, but I know a few things, and I'm happy to share what I do know and what I have found.
Thank you, that was great. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, so thank you. What are the, was there any brass or mercury found in the word I don't know substances? I should have probably also mentioned that I am, like, my degrees are histories and humanities, so all of the science part of these studies is somewhat lost on me, unfortunately. Oh, the orpiment. Okay. Was there any brass or mercury found in not that I remember in the gold. Was there any brass or mercury? Not that at least if they found it, they didn't report it, because that's something that I would have made a note of, just like I noted the silver rich or the with silver with gold. So in the bits that I found, no. That doesn't mean it. And I'm wondering, are you thinking that the brass? So mercury would have been, I mean, that's more for red colors. So brass, I know that they would have used as like their mortar and pestle. But mercury, I'm not sure about outside of vermilion. And that one, here, I'm just gonna, instead of making you flip through everything, I'm gonna go to my spreadsheet here for the yellows. Yeah, not that I'm seeing. Because I figured that those, if they were there, they would have pinged and they would have reported it. Yeah, absolutely. If you have anybody who wants to reach out, here's my email and the website where the information is. I actually have this in kind of packet form as well, because usually when I teach this, I give you a packet of like 20 pages of charts and the narrative rundown. I will say that they use mercury to work with gold. In the recipes for gold making that I have found from these two sources, they did not talk about using mercury. Not that it wasn't used, but it wasn't talked about in these two period manuals. So I don't know if that was a regional thing and it's just not been found in the manuscripts that were studied, because let's be fair, this is like the tiniest of drops in a huge bucket of manuscripts that are out there. These are just all the ones that I could collect that were in English. Because at the end of the day, I, as a scribe, wanted a quick reference for, we had a crown that was Ottoman, and so I wanted to be able to create something in the palette that would have been appropriate, and so this was kind of the end result of that. The PowerPoint is not on my website or in the proceedings yet, but I will be sending both. I know that for my class yesterday, I ended up finding some pieces that needed to be tweaked, so I'm glad I hadn't sent them yet. But I will get those both uploaded to the website and sent out. This information is on my website. If you, like, there's a whole, it's like wordpress.org/Middle Eastern Pigments. Let me see if I can copy the whole thing. So everything that's here is there, including access to the spreadsheet. And as I get new information, I add it to that Google Doc spreadsheet. So that is kind of a running tally of everything I've found. So if I find, because they're doing these studies more and more, and they're becoming more and more accessible to the public. At the time, I was working for a local university, so I had access to behind the paywall, and that was another big influence to putting this together, because at the time, most of these studies were behind a paywall. And authors are usually really awesome about sending you their work if they are behind a paywall. But since I had access to it, I was like, let me put everything together. And now I'm a high school teacher, and so I can't access behind the paywall anymore. And I'm glad I have the source now. Yeah, it looks like we've got about 5 more minutes. If you have any other questions or things to add to my to-do list, because these are like the questions I've gotten are super awesome, and I wish I had better answers for them, because it's like it's new rabbit holes for me to explore, and that's really exciting.
So we have ample of time. There's nothing scheduled after this. The stream will end at the latest at what's 2 o'clock. That's like next hour in 10 minutes. But so you're good.
Yeah, well, I've still, like, it's 10 o'clock my time, but I still have to grab dinner before the roadshow.
Yeah, and after that is the roadshow. So just to be sure that I save the recording correctly, I'll probably close it sometime after 1, like what is after 9 for you probably, or 10, whatever.
So the Illuminators palette is on my wish list, and I almost ordered it the other day, and then I got distracted because that's what I do. And yes, I'm super here for that sort of thing. Thank you so much for mentioning it so that I can remember.
Do you want to stop the recording now?
Yep. Yep, thank you all for joining.